Sometimes the truth doesn't hide in words. It hides in the dates people are too afraid to revisit. Ethan Callaway had spent the last 11 months convincing himself that walking away had been the most logical decision of his life. As chairman of Callaway Holdings, logic had always been the foundation beneath every choice he made, every contract he signed, every risk he accepted, and every opportunity he rejected. Feelings complicated judgment, and judgment built empires. That belief had carried him through boardroom battles, hostile acquisitions, and financial crises that would have broken lesser executives. Yet on an unusually warm Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, all the certainty he had carefully constructed over nearly a year began to fracture the moment he stepped through the entrance of the Harrison Foundation Charity Gala. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished marble floors while conversations blended into the soft sound of a live string quartet. Business leaders, philanthropists, and public officials exchanged polite smiles beneath towering floral arrangements. Ethan acknowledged familiar faces with effortless professionalism, but his attention remained fixed on the evening's agenda. A brief speech, a few photographs, several strategic conversations. Then home. It was supposed to be another predictable appearance. Instead, everything changed in less than 5 seconds. Across the ballroom, standing beside an exhibit showcasing architectural restoration projects, was Claire Bennett. She wore a simple navy blue maternity dress that somehow made her appear even more graceful than he remembered. Her hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and one hand instinctively supported the gentle curve beneath the fabric. Ethan stopped walking. The sounds around him faded into a distant blur. He had imagined running into Claire hundreds of times since she disappeared from his life. Sometimes she looked angry. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she ignored him completely. Never, not once, had he imagined seeing her pregnant. His breathing slowed instead of quickening. Years of executive discipline refused to let panic reach the surface. No one nearby noticed the subtle change in his expression except his longtime executive assistant, Daniel Foster, who quietly stepped closer. "Mr. Callaway?" Daniel asked under his breath. Ethan never answered. His eyes remained locked on Claire. She laughed softly at something an elderly donor had said before thanking him with the same warm smile Ethan remembered from quiet Sunday mornings, before conference calls replaced breakfast conversations and business flights became more common than evenings at home. She looked peaceful. That unsettled him even more than the pregnancy itself. Claire had not looked peaceful the day she left. She had stood inside the foyer of their apartment, holding a single overnight bag while rain tapped against the windows. She had spoken calmly, almost gently, saying only that sometimes love stopped surviving long before people admitted it. Ethan had expected an argument. Instead, she had simply walked away. No accusations. No dramatic goodbye. Just silence. He never chased after her. Pride had convinced him that if someone chose to leave, they should be allowed to leave. Months later, he still repeated that reasoning whenever her memory surfaced unexpectedly. Yet now, seeing her standing only 40 feet away with unmistakable evidence that her life had continued without him, something refused to fit together. Ethan forced himself to examine only facts. They had separated 11 months ago. Their legal paperwork had taken several weeks afterward. He knew every milestone because he had buried himself in work immediately afterward. Numbers never lied. Dates never changed. Yet the quiet certainty that usually accompanied his calculations failed to arrive. Claire turned slightly, speaking with another guest, and instinctively rested her palm across her abdomen. The movement was small, almost unconscious. Ethan noticed it immediately. His chest tightened for reasons he refused to define. Daniel carefully followed his employer's gaze before lowering his voice again. "Would you like me to arrange a meeting with Ms. Bennett?" Ethan finally blinked. No, his answer came almost automatically. "Not tonight." Daniel nodded once. Understood. Ethan remained exactly where he stood as Claire accepted a glass of sparkling water from a waiter instead of champagne. Another detail. Another date silently demanded attention inside his mind. She wasn't pretending. This wasn't a misunderstanding. The pregnancy was real. Several guests approached Ethan to congratulate him on the company's recent expansion, but he responded mechanically, barely hearing their words. Across the room, Claire never once looked in his direction. Whether she genuinely hadn't seen him or deliberately avoided him, he couldn't tell. Oddly, The uncertainty bothered him less than one simple question that refused to disappear. When? Not who. Not why. Only when. His memory, trained by years of reviewing contracts down to individual signatures and timestamps, began assembling fragments without permission. A delayed business trip. An anniversary dinner they almost canceled. A weekend cabin reservation neither of them discussed afterward. Ordinary moments that suddenly seemed far more significant than they had ever appeared before. Ethan quietly adjusted his cufflinks and turned toward Daniel for the first time since entering the ballroom. His voice remained calm enough that no one nearby would suspect anything had changed. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I want every calendar I used during the final 3 months before Claire left. Every itinerary, every travel confirmation, every meeting schedule. Nothing gets overlooked." Daniel hesitated only briefly. "Everything." Ethan looked once more across the ballroom, where Claire smiled politely while accepting congratulations from another guest, completely unaware that a single glimpse of her had just reopened a chapter he believed had been permanently closed. "Everything," he repeated softly. "Every important date." The following morning, the executive floor of Callaway Holdings was quieter than usual. Before most employees had finished their first cup of coffee, Ethan Callaway was already seated alone in the conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline. The polished walnut table had disappeared beneath neatly stacked folders, printed calendars, travel confirmations, hotel receipts, meeting schedules, and handwritten notes that his assistant, Daniel Foster, had gathered before sunrise. Daniel entered carrying one final binder and placed it beside Ethan without interrupting his concentration. "Everything you requested is here," he said quietly. "Personal calendar, corporate calendar, flight records, expense reports, and archived meeting summaries." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." Daniel hesitated near the door. "Should I cancel your appointments this morning?" Ethan kept his eyes on the documents. "Only the non-essential ones." Daniel understood immediately. For nearly 12 years, he had watched Ethan solve impossible business problems through patience rather than emotion. Today felt different. Ethan was not searching for profit or negotiating leverage. He was searching for certainty. After the door closed, silence settled over the room. Ethan opened the oldest planner first. Every page reflected the life he had once believed was perfectly organized. Meetings began precisely on time. Flights departed according to schedule. Investor dinners filled nearly every evening. Yet hidden between those carefully planned commitments were handwritten reminders that no assistant had ever entered into the company system. Dinner with Claire. Anniversary weekend. Doctor appointment with Claire. The last note stopped him. He frowned slightly. He remembered driving her to a medical clinic one rainy Tuesday afternoon because she had complained about persistent fatigue. She had insisted it was nothing serious, and after the appointment, they had stopped at a neighborhood bakery where she laughed because the cashier accidentally placed 2 slices of lemon cake into the same box instead of one. It had been such an ordinary afternoon that Ethan had nearly forgotten it entirely. He turned another page. 3 days later, an emergency board meeting forced him to cancel a weekend trip they had planned months earlier. Claire had smiled and told him she understood. She always seemed to understand. At the time, he had appreciated her patience. Looking back now, he wondered how many disappointments had quietly accumulated behind that gentle smile. Ethan continued reviewing every week with methodical precision. Flight to Seattle. Return to Chicago. Quarterly shareholder dinner. Charity luncheon. Hotel reservation. Conference keynote. Each event fit together exactly as he remembered, yet something kept drawing his attention to the spaces between those appointments. The evenings they spent at home. The quiet mornings before sunrise. The conversations that never seemed important enough to remember until they disappeared forever. He opened another folder containing archived emails that Daniel had recovered from the company server. Most concerned business matters, but a handful had been exchanged between Ethan and Claire during particularly busy weeks. One message simply read, "Drive safely. Dinner will stay warm." Another said, "Do not worry about getting home late. I saved you dessert." Ethan stared at those words longer than he expected. There had never been anger in her messages. Never resentment. Just kindness. He closed his eyes briefly before forcing himself back to the timeline. Facts first. Emotions later. He reached the month before Claire left. His pencil moved quietly across a legal pad as he listed important dates in chronological order. business conference, family dinner, anniversary, medical appointment, weekend at the lake house, product launch, charity gala, apartment lease renewal. Every date formed part of a larger picture that still remained incomplete. Then he noticed something unusual. The weekend at the lake house had almost disappeared from his memory because no photographs existed. Claire had forgotten her phone charger, and Ethan had deliberately left his own phone inside his briefcase for nearly 2 days. No conference calls, no interviews, no investors, just quiet walks along the shoreline, homemade breakfasts, and long conversations that had reminded both of them why they had fallen in love years earlier. Ethan looked down at the calendar again. His fingers remained perfectly still against the paper. Without realizing it, he reached for another document and compared the dates twice. Then a third time. The arithmetic remained unchanged. He leaned back slowly in his chair. The possibility that had seemed impossible only hours earlier no longer felt impossible at all. It simply felt unanswered. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel stepped inside carrying 2 cups of black coffee. He immediately noticed the dozens of pages spread across the table. Have you found something? Ethan remained silent for several seconds before speaking. Not proof. He looked down once more at the carefully ordered timeline stretching across the conference table. But I have found enough to know I should have started asking questions much sooner. Daniel followed Ethan's gaze without speaking. The room grew quiet again as morning sunlight crossed the documents one by one, illuminating every date that had once seemed ordinary but now appeared connected by a truth still waiting to reveal itself. By late afternoon, the conference room no longer resembled a place where corporate strategies were planned. It looked more like the workspace of someone patiently reconstructing a forgotten chapter of his own life. Ethan Calloway stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a legal pad in one hand and a cup of untouched coffee in the other. Outside, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath a clear autumn sky, but he barely noticed it. His attention remained fixed on the sequence of dates spread across the long table behind him. Every calendar entry had been verified. Every business trip matched the airline records. Every hotel reservation aligned with expense reports. For the first time in years, there were no missing pieces in the timeline. Yet the complete picture unsettled him even more than the uncertainty had. He slowly returned to the table and picked up another folder labeled personal travel. Inside was a confirmation for their weekend at the lake house. The reservation had begun on a Friday evening and ended Sunday afternoon. Ethan remembered arriving later than planned because a board meeting had run over schedule. He remembered apologizing the entire drive. Claire had simply smiled and said that 2 quiet days together were worth waiting for. He remembered cooking breakfast the following morning, even though his pancakes had been uneven and slightly overcooked. Claire had laughed anyway. She always claimed they tasted better because he rarely slowed down enough to make them. Strange how insignificant memories survived when larger conversations faded away. He opened another document. A medical appointment appeared on the calendar less than 2 weeks after that trip. He had almost forgotten driving Claire there. She had insisted she only felt unusually tired because work had become stressful. The physician had recommended additional blood work and a follow-up visit. Ethan searched the remaining records but found no second appointment listed on their shared calendar. That detail lingered in his thoughts. Claire had always organized every commitment carefully. Forgetting a follow-up visit would not have been like her, unless she had chosen not to place it on the calendar at all. Ethan sat down and quietly reviewed the dates once again. 11 months since she left. Nearly 10 months since the weekend at the lake house. The estimated stage of her pregnancy, based only on what he had observed at the gala, did not create contradictions. Instead, it removed them. His phone vibrated softly across the table. The caller identification displayed the name of his younger sister, Olivia. He answered after a brief pause. She immediately noticed the unusual silence in his voice. "You sound exhausted," she said gently. Ethan looked at the pages scattered before him. "I have been reviewing old records." Olivia laughed lightly. "That sounds exactly like something you would do." He almost smiled. "Do you remember the weekend Claire and I went to the lake house last year?" There was a brief silence before Olivia answered. "Of course I do. Claire called me afterward because she was so happy that you finally turned your phone off for 2 whole days. She told me she felt like she had her husband back, even if only for a weekend." Ethan lowered his eyes. That sentence settled heavily in the quiet room. Did she ever mention feeling sick afterward? He asked carefully. Olivia hesitated. Not exactly. She said she had been unusually tired for a while, but she thought work was catching up with her. Why are you asking now? Ethan looked again at the dates. I am trying to understand something. Olivia sensed there was more behind the question, but she respected his silence. If this is about Claire, she said softly, do not let pride make another decision for you. After the call ended, Ethan remained motionless for several minutes. His sister had unknowingly confirmed another small piece of the timeline. Claire had been hopeful after that weekend, not distant. Whatever had happened afterward had happened quickly. He gathered the documents into careful stacks before stopping at one final envelope Daniel had placed aside earlier because it appeared unrelated. Inside was a receipt from a neighborhood bookstore dated only 4 days before Claire moved out. Ethan frowned. Claire loved bookstores, but this receipt included only one purchase. A hardcover journal. He remembered giving it to her months earlier as a birthday gift because she enjoyed writing private reflections at the end of difficult days. If she had purchased another journal just before leaving, perhaps the first one had already been filled. Ethan carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into his jacket pocket. It was not evidence. It answered nothing. Yet for the first time since seeing Claire again, he realized that the truth might not be hidden inside financial records or corporate calendars at all. It might still exist within the quiet moments she had chosen to keep only for herself. Claire Bennett unlocked the door to her apartment just as the late afternoon sunlight slipped through the hallway window. The building was modest but welcoming, tucked onto a quiet street lined with maple trees that had already begun turning shades of amber and gold. She paused for a moment before stepping inside, instinctively placing one hand beneath her growing belly as if greeting the little life that quietly accompanied her everywhere. The apartment was small compared to the spacious condominium she had once shared with Ethan, yet every corner reflected choices she had made herself. A bookshelf filled with architecture journals stood beside the window. Framed sketches leaned against freshly painted walls, waiting for the day she would decide where they belonged. A rocking chair sat near the nursery door, still unfinished except for a neatly folded blanket draped across the back. Claire smiled softly as she switched on a lamp and set her handbag on the kitchen counter. Her day had been long, but it had been productive. The nonprofit restoration project she had accepted months earlier was finally moving toward construction, and seeing the old community center slowly return to life reminded her why she had fallen in love with architecture in the first place. Creating spaces where people could begin again somehow made beginning again herself feel possible. She poured a glass of cold water and stood quietly by the window overlooking the neighborhood. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk while a young couple struggled to teach an energetic golden retriever how to walk politely on a leash. Ordinary moments like these had once seemed invisible to her when every week revolved around corporate dinners, charity galas, and international flights scheduled around Ethan's calendar. She did not resent that life. She simply recognized now that she had disappeared inside it without realizing how much of herself she had quietly set aside. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Claire opened the door to find her closest friend, Megan Sullivan, balancing 2 paper grocery bags and wearing the familiar smile that always made difficult days feel lighter. I brought dinner, Megan announced. And before you tell me that I should not have, I also brought fresh fruit, whole grain bread, and the tea your doctor recommended. Claire laughed for what felt like the first time all week. You always come prepared. They unpacked the groceries together while talking about ordinary things. The weather, work, the nursery furniture that still needed to be assembled. Eventually, Megan glanced toward the framed ultrasound picture resting quietly on the bookshelf. Have you thought about telling him? She asked gently. Claire's hands became still as she folded a dish towel. She had known the question would come eventually. Every day, she admitted. And every day I decide not to. Megan studied her carefully. Because you are afraid? Claire slowly shook her head. No, because I remember the man he had become before I left. She walked toward the window, watching evening settle across the street below. He measured everything by schedules, meetings, quarterly goals, and responsibilities. He was carrying so much that he could barely hear himself think. If I had told him then, I do not know whether he would have heard the news or simply added another obligation to an already impossible list. Megan remained silent, allowing Claire to continue. I did not leave because I stopped loving him, Claire said quietly. I left because I could feel us becoming strangers who happened to share the same address. Love cannot survive forever if only one person notices it fading. Her voice never trembled. She had repeated those thoughts enough times to herself that they had become calm truths rather than fresh wounds. Megan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Do you think he has changed? Claire looked toward the ultrasound photograph once more. I honestly do not know. After Megan left later that evening, Claire carried a small storage box from the bedroom closet and placed it on the coffee table. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, ticket stubs from concerts, handwritten notes, and a leather-bound journal tied with a pale blue ribbon. She gently rested her fingertips on the cover, but did not open it. Some memories deserved respect, even when they still hurt. Instead, she closed the lid again and returned the box to the closet shelf. Before turning off the lights, Claire stepped into the nursery. Moonlight filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating the empty crib waiting quietly in the corner. She smiled and whispered, "You are already so loved." Then, without realizing it, she glanced toward the window as though sensing that somewhere across the city, someone else had finally begun looking backward instead of forward, trying to understand the moments that had once seemed too ordinary to matter. The following morning began with an unfamiliar sense of urgency that no board meeting had ever created. Ethan Calloway arrived at his office before sunrise, but instead of walking directly into the executive suite, he stopped beside the large window overlooking the city. Chicago was slowly waking beneath a pale orange sky, and for the first time in years he found himself paying almost no attention to the financial headlines scrolling across the television mounted in the reception area. His thoughts remained fixed on Claire, on the carefully reconstructed timeline spread across his desk, and on the quiet realization that the facts no longer supported the story he had repeated to himself since their separation. A gentle knock broke the silence before Daniel Foster stepped inside, carrying another folder. "I received the information you requested," Daniel said. "There is nothing confidential here. These are only public records and appointment confirmations that Claire voluntarily shared with the nonprofit organization she works with during scheduling." Ethan accepted the folder without speaking. Inside were several event schedules connected to Claire's architectural projects, including the charity gala where he had seen her only days earlier. Attached to one page was a note confirming that organizers had adjusted the event layout to ensure easy access because of her pregnancy. Ethan quietly read the date of the confirmation. It matched perfectly with everything he had already calculated. Instead of creating new questions, it strengthened the same conclusion that had been forming piece by piece. Daniel watched him carefully. "Does it help?" Ethan slowly closed the folder. "It removes another possibility." "Meaning?" Ethan answered with unusual honesty. "Meaning I can no longer convince myself that I imagined the timeline incorrectly." Daniel remained silent. During years of working together, he had learned that Ethan rarely spoke before reaching certainty. The chairman was not impulsive. Every conclusion came only after exhausting every alternative explanation. Ethan walked toward the conference table and compared the latest documents with his handwritten notes. Every calendar entry aligned. Every business trip matched. Every personal commitment remained exactly where memory said it should be. Even the quiet weekend at the lake house fit naturally into the sequence. He picked up his pencil again, stared at the page for several long seconds, then quietly placed it down. There was nothing left to calculate. Mathematics had reached its limit. What remained was life itself. Later that afternoon, Ethan left the office without notifying anyone except Daniel. Instead of returning home, he drove through familiar neighborhoods until he reached the small bookstore whose receipt he had found among the old papers. The owner, an elderly woman arranging a display of new releases near the entrance, greeted him warmly, even though she did not recognize him. Ethan wandered slowly through the shelves until he reached the journal section. Leather-bound notebooks, similar to the one Claire had purchased, filled an entire display. He picked one up, running his fingertips across the cover. He remembered giving Claire her first journal because she once told him that writing allowed her to organize feelings the same way architects organized space. "Those have always been popular," the owner said with a friendly smile. "People usually buy them when they feel a new chapter beginning." Ethan looked down at the notebook before quietly returning it to the shelf. The words stayed with him long after he walked back outside. A new chapter. Claire had purchased one only days before leaving. Had she written about hope, or disappointment, or both? He would probably never know unless she chose to tell him herself. As evenings settled over the city, Ethan parked near the river walk instead of driving directly home. Families strolled beside the water. Couples shared quiet conversations on park benches. Children laughed as they chased one another across the open plaza. It struck him that life had continued around him even while he buried himself inside conference rooms and quarterly reports. He had measured success by growth charts and financial statements, yet the moments surrounding him could never be summarized inside a spreadsheet. His phone vibrated. A message from Olivia appeared on the screen. "Have you spoken with Claire yet?" Ethan read the words twice before replying with unusual simplicity. "Not yet. I wanted to understand before I interrupted her piece." Olivia answered almost immediately. "Understanding is important. But eventually the truth has to be shared between people, not just discovered alone." Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket and watched the last light disappear beyond the skyline. He knew she was right. The documents had done everything they could. The calendars had spoken. The dates had answered every question they were capable of answering. None of them could tell him why Claire had chosen silence, and none of them could reveal what she had carried alone during the months after she walked away. Only Claire could do that. For the first time since seeing her again, Ethan accepted a truth that both frightened and relieved him. If he wanted the rest of the story, he would have to stop searching through old records and find the courage to face the one person who had lived every unanswered moment beside him. 3 days passed before Ethan finally accepted that no amount of careful analysis would answer the questions that mattered most. Every document had been reviewed. Every date had been compared. Every reasonable explanation had been considered. The remaining uncertainty existed only between two people who had once shared a life. On a cool Friday afternoon, Ethan left his office earlier than usual and drove across the city without notifying anyone except Daniel, who simply nodded when he saw his employer pick up his jacket. Ethan had already learned from public information that Claire often spent Friday afternoons supervising renovations at the Jefferson Community Center, a century-old brick building being restored into a neighborhood arts center. He parked across the street and remained inside his car for several minutes, watching volunteers carry paint supplies through the front entrance while children chased one another across the nearby playground. The atmosphere felt completely different from the polished corporate world he inhabited every day. There were no cameras, no investors, no carefully rehearsed speeches. Only ordinary people working together to improve something that mattered to them. Through the open entrance, Ethan finally saw Claire. She stood near a large table covered with architectural drawings, calmly explaining adjustments to a contractor while occasionally resting one hand against her side. She smiled often, listened carefully, and thanked every volunteer by name. It struck Ethan that she seemed lighter than he remembered, not because her life had become easier, but because she was finally living at a pace that allowed her to breathe. He stepped out of the car and crossed the street. As he entered the building, Claire looked up almost immediately. Their eyes met across the room. Neither of them moved for several seconds. The conversations around them continued, but everything else seemed to fade into the background. Claire quietly excused herself from the group and walked toward him with measured steps. She stopped several feet away. "Hello, Ethan," she said softly. Her voice carried neither anger nor surprise, only quiet composure. "Hello, Claire." He realized he had imagined this conversation countless times, yet every prepared sentence had disappeared. Claire waited patiently. "I did not expect to see you here," she said. Ethan glanced around the renovated hall before returning his attention to her. "I almost did not come." A faint smile crossed her face. "That sounds honest." For a brief moment, both of them remembered how easily honesty had once existed between them. Ethan took a slow breath. "May we talk?" Claire looked toward the volunteers still working nearby. "There is a small garden behind the building." She turned without waiting for his response. Ethan followed quietly. The garden overlooked a narrow walking path lined with flowering shrubs and wooden benches. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh earth after a light morning rain. Claire sat carefully on one of the benches while Ethan remained standing for a moment before taking the opposite end, leaving respectful space between them. Silence settled comfortably instead of awkwardly. Claire was the first to speak. "You have been trying to solve something." Ethan looked at her with mild surprise. "How did you know?" She smiled gently. Because that is how you have always handled uncertainty. You gather information until everything makes sense. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. This time it did not. Claire nodded once. Some things cannot be understood from calendars. He let those words settle before answering. I know that now. Another quiet pause followed. Ethan chose his next words carefully. I have spent the last several days looking backward instead of forward. I remembered the lake house, the doctor appointment, the plans we kept postponing. I realized how many moments I noticed only after they were gone. Claire listened without interrupting. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes revealed the weight of memories she had carried much longer than he had. Why are you telling me this? She asked gently. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. Because I owe you the truth. I was so focused on building a future that I stopped paying attention to the person I wanted to share it with. Claire looked toward the garden for several long seconds before speaking again. You are not entirely wrong. Her honesty encouraged him, but she continued before hope could become certainty. You were not cruel, Ethan. You were simply somewhere else, even when you were sitting beside me. Those words landed more heavily than any accusation could have. Ethan accepted them without argument because he knew they were true. Finally, he looked at her with quiet sincerity. There is one question I need to ask, but I will only ask it once. Claire slowly turned back toward him. Their eyes met again, and for the first time since their separation, neither of them looked away. Ethan's voice remained steady. Is the child you are carrying mine? Claire closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as though gathering strength she had hoped she would never need again. When she opened them, there were no tears, only calm certainty. You came much later than I once wished you would, she said softly. But you finally asked the right question. Claire held Ethan's gaze for several quiet seconds before speaking again. The breeze stirred the leaves above them, and somewhere beyond the garden fence children laughed as they played, their voices drifting gently through the afternoon air. The ordinary sounds made the silence between them feel even more personal. Yes, she said at last, her voice calm and steady. The baby is yours. Ethan did not speak. He had imagined hearing those words countless times over the previous days, yet now that they had finally been spoken, they carried a weight no amount of preparation could soften. He lowered his eyes briefly, taking a slow breath before looking back at Claire. Why did you never tell me? He asked quietly. Claire folded her hands together and looked toward the flower beds that volunteers had planted only a few weeks earlier. I wanted to, she admitted. More than once. She smiled faintly, though sadness rested behind the expression. The day I learned I was pregnant, I drove to your office. I parked across the street and stayed there for almost an hour. Ethan frowned. I never knew. She nodded. I know. I watched people rushing in and out of the building. Your assistant came outside twice to answer phone calls. Every person looked like they were carrying something urgent. I kept thinking that if I walked upstairs, I would become one more emergency waiting outside your office. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered that week clearly now. A major acquisition had consumed every waking hour. Investors had demanded constant updates. His calendar had been filled from dawn until late at night. At the time, he had believed the pressure was temporary. Looking back, he realized temporary had quietly become permanent. Claire continued gently. I left before you ever saw my car. She reached into her handbag and removed a folded envelope that had softened along the edges with time. A few days later, I wrote you a letter. Ethan accepted it carefully, but did not open it. I never mailed it, Claire said. Every time I read it again, I asked myself the same question. If I told you because I wanted you to stay, would you stay because you loved me, or because you felt responsible? Ethan looked down at the unopened envelope resting in his hands. You should have let me make that decision. Claire nodded slowly. Perhaps, but I also had to make one of my own. She looked directly at him again. I loved you enough not to ask you to choose between your dream and your family when I believed you were already choosing your dream every single day. Her words were gentle, never accusing, and somehow that honesty hurt more than anger ever could. Ethan remembered countless evenings when he had promised to finish work early only to arrive home after midnight. He remembered postponed vacations, interrupted dinners, and conversations cut short because another call could not wait. None of those moments had seemed large enough to end a marriage. Together, however, they had quietly built a wall neither of them noticed until it was too high to cross. I thought giving you space was respecting your decision, Ethan admitted. When you walked away, I believed you no longer wanted me in your life. Claire shook her head with quiet sadness. I wanted you, Ethan. I simply could not keep asking for a version of you that only appeared for a few hours before disappearing into another meeting. Tears never came to either of them. There was only truth, spoken carefully after months of silence. Ethan looked toward the community center where volunteers continued painting together, laughing as they worked. I have spent years believing success meant never failing the people who depended on me, he said softly. I never realized the person depending on me most was sitting across the dinner table every night. Claire smiled sadly. I never wanted perfection. I only wanted partnership. Ethan slowly unfolded the letter but stopped before reading the first line. May I keep this? He asked. Claire nodded. It belongs to both of us now. Another quiet silence settled between them, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. Ethan finally looked at her with a sincerity that reached beyond apology. I cannot change the man I was. Claire listened without interrupting. But if you are willing, I would like the chance to become the man our child deserves to know. Claire rested a gentle hand over her abdomen before answering. That decision will not be made in one conversation. Ethan accepted the answer immediately. I understand. She stood slowly from the bench, preparing to return inside. Before taking a step, she turned back toward him one final time. There is one thing you should know, she said quietly. The baby already knows your voice. Ethan looked at her in surprise. Claire smiled for the first time without sadness. I still played the recordings of your speeches whenever the baby became restless. Every single time, the kicking stopped. She walked back toward the community center, leaving Ethan standing beneath the trees with the unopened letter in his hands and the quiet realization that despite everything they had lost, a small part of him had remained close to his child all along without either of them ever knowing it. Nearly 2 weeks passed after their conversation in the garden, and neither Ethan nor Claire tried to force what time alone still needed to repair. They exchanged only a handful of messages, each one simple and sincere. Ethan asked how she was feeling. Claire answered honestly. Claire sent him a photograph of the nearly finished community center. Ethan congratulated her on the progress. The conversations remained careful, but unlike the silence that had separated them before, this silence was no longer built from distance. It was built from patience. Ethan gradually changed habits that had once seemed impossible to break. Meetings ended when they were scheduled to end instead of stretching late into the evening. Weekend appointments disappeared from his calendar. Daniel noticed first, but wisely said nothing. The executive team noticed next, surprised that the chairman occasionally declined dinners with investors because of personal commitments. Ethan no longer apologized for those decisions. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing contracts in his office, his phone rang. The caller identification displayed Claire's name. Ethan answered immediately. Before he could speak, he heard her take a slow breath. Ethan, she said quietly, I am at Mercy Memorial Hospital. Every muscle in his body tightened. Are you all right? The doctor wants to keep me here for observation. The baby is doing well, but they would like to monitor us because I have been experiencing regular contractions earlier than expected. Ethan was already reaching for his jacket. Which room? She gave him the number before adding softly. You do not have to come if you are in the middle of something important. Ethan smiled despite the concern in his chest. Claire, he answered gently. There is nothing more important. Less than 30 minutes later, he hurried through the hospital entrance, passing families gathered in the waiting area and nurses moving calmly through bright hallways. The scent of antiseptic and fresh coffee filled the air. At the reception desk, he introduced himself before being directed upstairs. When he reached Claire's room, he paused briefly outside the door, taking one steadying breath before knocking softly. Come in, Claire called. She looked tired but peaceful, sitting comfortably against a raised hospital bed, while a heart monitor quietly displayed steady rhythms beside her. Ethan walked inside, carrying a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. Claire looked at it and smiled. Lemon cake? She asked. He nodded. I remembered. Her smile became warmer. You remembered. He placed the bag on the bedside table before pulling a chair closer. What did the doctor say? Claire glanced toward the monitor. The contraction slowed after I arrived. They believe stress and exhaustion may have contributed. They want me to stay overnight just to be safe. Ethan nodded, relief softening his expression. Then I will stay too. Claire looked at him with gentle surprise. You have meetings tomorrow. Daniel has already moved them. She studied him for a long moment before quietly saying, You really are changing. Ethan leaned back in the chair. I am trying. The afternoon passed peacefully. They talked about ordinary things neither of them had shared in months. Claire described the volunteers who argued cheerfully over paint colors. Ethan admitted that he had recently learned the names of employees working in departments he had previously known only through reports. They laughed together when Ethan confessed that he had accidentally assembled a bookshelf backward after watching an online tutorial. The conversation felt natural, almost familiar, reminding both of them that friendship had always existed beneath the pain they carried. As evening settled outside, the doctor returned to review Claire's condition. Everything continues to look reassuring, she said with a smile. The baby is active, and both of you are doing well. We simply want one quiet night of observation. After she left, Ethan remained beside the window watching the lights of the city appear one by one beyond the hospital grounds. Claire noticed how different he seemed from the man she remembered. He checked his phone only once before placing it face down on the table. When another call arrived minutes later, he silenced it without reading the screen. You can answer if it is important, Claire said softly. Ethan looked at her before shaking his head. I have spent too many years confusing urgent with important. Those words lingered between them. Claire rested one hand gently over her abdomen, just as the baby shifted noticeably beneath the blanket. She smiled. Someone seems awake. Ethan hesitated. May I? Claire nodded. He slowly placed his hand where she guided him. For several quiet seconds nothing happened. Then a gentle movement pressed against his palm. Ethan froze, not from fear, but from wonder. Another tiny movement followed, stronger this time, and he laughed softly in disbelief. Claire watched the expression on his face change in a way she had never seen before. The chairman who had spent years making billion-dollar decisions suddenly looked like a man discovering the most extraordinary moment of his life. Neither of them noticed the rain beginning again outside the window. For the first time in a very long while, they were not thinking about what they had lost. They were simply sharing the quiet miracle that had been waiting patiently for both of them to arrive. Claire was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon with instructions to rest, reduce her workload, and return for regular checkups during the final weeks of her pregnancy. Ethan insisted on driving her home, and for the first time since they had separated, neither of them questioned whether sharing the same car would feel uncomfortable. The drive through Chicago passed in peaceful conversation about simple things that had once been overlooked. They talked about the changing leaves along the streets, about the community center opening scheduled for the following month, and about the bakery that still made Claire's favorite lemon cake. When they reached her apartment building, Ethan carried the overnight bag upstairs without being asked. Inside, the familiar warmth of Claire's home greeted them once again. Sunlight poured through the living room windows, illuminating the nursery that now looked almost complete. The bookshelf had been assembled, the rocking chair sat beside the crib, and a small mobile of stars and clouds slowly turned in the gentle breeze from the open window. Ethan stood quietly in the doorway, taking in every detail. You built all of this alone, he said softly. Claire smiled. Not entirely. Megan helped with the painting, and one of the volunteers built the crib. Ethan nodded. I wish I had been here. Claire looked at him for a long moment before answering. So do I. There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan did not attempt to reclaim the past through grand gestures or expensive gifts. Instead, he showed up consistently. He attended every medical appointment Claire invited him to. He helped organize donations for the community center without attaching the company's name to the project. He learned how to install a child safety seat after watching instructional videos more than once because he wanted to do it correctly. Daniel quietly adjusted Ethan's calendar so those commitments never conflicted with work, and when board members questioned the changes, Ethan simply replied that leadership began long before entering a conference room. One crisp autumn morning, several weeks later, Claire called Ethan shortly after sunrise. Her voice sounded calm, but different. I think today is the day, she said gently. Ethan arrived within minutes and drove her to Mercy Memorial Hospital while the city slowly awakened around them. The journey felt strangely peaceful. They spoke very little, yet neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. At the hospital, Nurses welcomed Claire with reassuring smiles, and Ethan remained beside her throughout the day, offering quiet encouragement whenever she reached for his hand. Hours later, the room filled with a new sound unlike anything Ethan had ever heard before. A healthy baby girl entered the world, and the nurse gently placed the tiny infant into Claire's arms before inviting Ethan to come closer. He looked down at his daughter with eyes filled not with disbelief this time, but with gratitude. Her tiny fingers wrapped instinctively around one of his. And in that single moment, every calendar, every business report, every carefully organized plan that had once seemed so important faded into the background. Claire looked at him over the baby's head and smiled through happy tears. "Would you like to hold her?" she asked. Ethan nodded carefully. When the nurse placed the baby into his arms, he held her with remarkable gentleness, afraid to move too quickly, as though he had been entrusted with the most precious responsibility imaginable. "She has your eyes," Claire whispered. Ethan smiled softly. "I think she has your peaceful heart." They named her Grace, a name both of them had quietly loved years earlier without ever knowing whether they would have the chance to use it. As evening settled outside the hospital windows, Olivia and Megan arrived carrying flowers and warm congratulations. Daniel stopped by briefly after work, leaving a small stuffed bear beside the crib before quietly excusing himself to give the family privacy. The room filled with laughter, gratitude, and a sense of hope that none of them had expected only weeks before. Several days later, after Claire and Grace returned home, Ethan stood beside the nursery window, watching his daughter sleep peacefully. Claire joined him, and for a while they simply admired the quiet miracle before them. "I cannot promise that we will never make mistakes again," Ethan said honestly. Claire slipped her hand into his. "Neither can I." He looked at her with the same sincerity that had slowly replaced certainty over the past several weeks. "But I can promise that I will never again allow success to become more important than the people I love." Claire smiled gently. "That is all I ever hoped to hear." She rested her head lightly against his shoulder while Grace continued sleeping peacefully nearby. Their future remained unwritten, and neither of them pretended that every wound had disappeared overnight. Trust would continue growing one ordinary day at a time. Yet as the evening sunlight filled the nursery with quiet warmth, both of them understood something that had taken far too long to learn. The most important moments in life were never found by looking backward through old calendars or searching for perfect timing. They were created by choosing, every single day, to be fully present for the people who mattered most.